Thank you for coming, and as I was saying, I'd rather read than do anything else, so I'm going to read, and I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just glad that you're here. I'm glad that we could all gather together. I'd like to thank the American Institute, my colleagues there, and at the Rachel Carson Center, and at the Berkeley Research and the Humanities Cooperation, and it's just been a wonderful event today, so thank you. I'm going to discuss what it means to rewrite New Orleans in contemporary literature. As we have seen in today's conference, New Orleans captures the imagination. Considering the place of New Orleans in contemporary literature, possibilities abound in literary texts. Not only the traditional forms of novels, poetry, short fiction, memoirs, and essays, but also digital storytelling and reading, drawing on our oldest ways of forming community, sharing experiences, and learning from each other. Digital forms may include podcasts, video, and audio clips as demonstrated in the presentation by Rachel Burnlin and Bruce Sunhai-Barnes. In gathering scholars, students, and educators to this conference, we are hoping to build a dialogue on research and teaching about New Orleans. I would like to share some of the resources I found helpful in teaching about the city and its literature. When learning about New Orleans from Europe, we often rely on literature, music, and visual media. While we tend to focus on contemporary work, new archival discoveries about the city continue to inform our knowledge of its history and the traditions that continue today. A recently recovered film, also mentioned by Larry Wilkie, of Mardi Gras from 1898, reported in the New York Times on June 23rd, so you're really quick, yeah. and believed to be the oldest film of New Orleans, brings together European and American scholars, as it somehow had wound up in the Eye Film Museum in Amsterdam, and was screened this past month at the Louisiana State Museum. More recently, the film, Always a Pleasure, directed and photographed by Les Blanc in 1978, Brian Wagner's recommendation to us, helped students from abroad to imagine the city, its celebrations and musical cultures. Helpfully, this film is available through the digital platform Canopy at our university library. There is a whole collection of Les Blanc films there, so that's great for us. Speaking to our current concerns about environment and culture, Spike Lee's documentary films on Hurricane Katrina, When the Levees Broke, A Requiem in 4 Acts, and the sequel, If God is Willing and the Creek Don't Rise, introduce the story of Hurricane Katrina to a broader public through a series of interviews interspersed with media and documentary film footage. As the circle of people learning and writing about New Orleans grows wider, the city continues with its traditions and community while drawing new visitors, new migrants, and creating new stories today. As an American living in Germany, teaching students about New Orleans literature from an international cross-cultural perspective, I've appreciated the opportunity to learn more about the city this semester from productive encounters with Brian Wagner and the meetings this week, and would like to introduce some themes that have arisen from these discussions. The first is creolization. A crossroads of cultures, creolization captures the vibrant mixture of African American, Afro-Caribbean, Cajun, Latin American, Native American, and European influences in New Orleans, as evident in John Lowe's Calypso Magnolia, the cross-currents of Caribbean and Southern literature, a reconfiguration of the, quote, global South and hemispheric and Atlantic studies, as well as Keith Cartwright's Sacral Grooves, Limbo Gateways, Travels in Deep Southern Time, Circum-Caribbean Space, Afro-Creole Authority, which swings low through ecologies and symbolic orders of creolized space. Creolization not only implies both the dynamism of a diverse cultural heritage, but is also implicated in the racialized caste structure in the U.S., to quote Isabel Wilkerson's recent publication, Caste, The Lies That Divide Us, with its roots in the slave trade and set into place after Reconstruction. In Edouard Glissant and the African Roots of Creolization, Sonia Ruth Malera writes that poetics appear when the dust settles from cultural collision, and the products of the impact of the relations between cultures begin to take shape. She notes that the events of history and the ways in which they form the future take place while people are simply trying to survive, and thus positions creolization in terms of cultural survival, of agency and self-determination. Our discussions have raised the question of whether cultural traditions should be considered as a pushing back against an oppressive social structure or as already existing practices that survive through admixture in places where traditions have been carried, developed, blended, and changed in new ways. The questions surrounding agency and structure, creolization, practices of place, and representation permeate the topic of cultural resilience in the literary study of New Orleans. Second topic is resilience. That's the topic of our conference, and one that we continue to discuss, and we have different ways of feeling about this and thinking about it and applying it to New Orleans. So I'd like to take this up further. We will tomorrow as a group, and thinking about it to some extent today. To address what we as humans seek in times of uncertainty, both in our natural and cultural environments, resilience seems an appropriate theme. And yet our conversations reveal that a concept that implies strength, the ability to overcome, to rebound, so intrinsic to American culture and its emphasis on renewal, may also unwittingly collapse agency and structure. For educators at all stages, we implicitly or explicitly address the questions of how to support resilience in children and young adults. What enables environmental and cultural resilience? At what points are the limitations and the current structure disabling to human, environmental, and cultural resilience? How can educators support knowledge of New Orleans culture and literature while offering new ways of imagining the city's future? How do stories, whether in print, digital, or visual media, help us to understand resilience, individual and communal agency, and social structures? The next section is Rain Shower. Who knows that song?
Rain shower, rain shower.
Love that song. I would now like to turn to a brief tour of literary angles on New Orleans. The threat of flooding from hurricanes along the Gulf Coast and its ecological and economic history and the management of wetlands have a long history, reaching back to Hurricane Betsy in 1965 and Camille in 1969 and before this, and more recently Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and Ida in 2021. In A New Literary History of America, editors Grail Marcus and Van Zollers point to Hurricane Katrina as a cultural turning point. For those of us far from New Orleans at the time, the reality of this tragedy defied representation. The words of Zora Neale Hurston, "From Their Eyes Were Watching God," in response to the Okeechobee hurricane in Florida in 1928, came to mind for me as it did for Marcus and Zollers. And this is a quote from her work, her novel. "They seemed to be staring at the dark, but their eyes were watching God. 10 feet higher and far as they could see, the muttering wall advanced before the braced-up waters like a road crusher on a cosmic scale. The monstrophilous beast had left his bed." Reflecting her experience as an anthropologist, folklorist, storyteller, and author, Hurston's literary imagery maintains the memory of this hurricane and gives us words for the unspeakable. At the time of Katrina in 2005, I was teaching New Orleans literature. I've been doing this for a long time in Illinois, at 2 years after visiting the city, and led a conversation at a local conference for university educators. My presentation, Teaching After Katrina, addressed how teachers are sometimes called upon to combine both social and literary analysis in response to crisis. At this conference, I played a blues song by Oludara called Rain Shower, and recounted the kinds of questions that arose in the wake of the hurricane, the complexities of rebuilding, the causes of flooding, the disaster of a delayed government response that highlighted systemic racism, all questions that arise more frequently now with the urgency of social and environmental crises. While literature may seem far from reality, discussing a literary text often allows a way to gather and discuss social issues, an increasingly difficult task in our politically polarized times. At that conference, a poet and teacher who had been displaced from New Orleans to Urbana, Illinois, commented that she was moved. She hadn't expected that anyone so far away would care. In an increasingly interconnected world, we struggle sometimes to understand each other. But we also care for and about each other, and it often seems there are fewer than 6 degrees of separation, as we have felt at this conference today. Literary scholar Suzanne Keene defines narrative empathy as, quote, "the sharing of feeling and perspective-taking induced by viewing, hearing, or imagining narratives of another's situation and condition." The creation of what she calls a story world in literature is central to narrative empathy. The story allows us to meet across borders of experience and to learn from each other. Over time, what had seemed a remote possibility, the flooding of a coastal city, has become more common, and as water levels rise, coastal cities of the U.S. have faced historic flooding. Here in Germany, a recent commemoration ceremony marked the anniversary of the disastrous flooding of towns in the Rhine Basin on July 14th and 15th, 2021. We have common ground. Studying the imagery of water in New Orleans literature includes the lakes, swamps, wetlands, the Mississippi River, the Gulf of Mexico, and what Paul Gilroy calls the Black Atlantic, with reference to the forced migration of enslaved people. The stories of New Orleans are carried along the currents from Cuba, Haiti, and Mexico, with different orientations to the sea and the relations of power that it represents, as developed in John Low's Calypso Magnolium. From Kate Chopin's The Awakening, the voice of the sea is seductive, never ceasing, whispering, clamoring, murmuring, inviting the soul to wander in abysses of solitude. References to water permeate texts of New Orleans and the Gulf states in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including works by George Washington Cable, Grace King, Alice Dunbar Nelson, and Zora Neale Hurston, through the narratives of Hurricane Katrina, including Dave Eggers' Zaytun, the story of Abdul-Rahman Zaytun, a Syrian-born American citizen who remains in New Orleans to rescue his neighbors during Hurricane Katrina. There's a lot more to that story that I won't go into. We will discuss. To the recently published memoir Yellow House by Sarah Broom. Following Hurricane Katrina, the difficult question asked by many regarding the choice to stay or to leave has been answered by authors who live along the Gulf Coast, including Jesmyn Ward in her essay, We Do Not Swim in Our Cemeteries, A Legacy of Not Evacuating. And she wrote a novel based on her personal experience called Savage to Bones, which I've taught. Scholars have also studied the choice in terms of place knowledge, such as LMU scholar Nadine Kaufler's article, Choosing to Stay, Hurricane Katrina Narratives and the History of Claiming Place Knowledge in New Orleans. The desire to stay reflects an orientation towards home, a desire for a home place, which Bell Hooks defines as a site of resistance, renewal, and self-recovery. Thaddeus Davis' detailed study of the regional, historical, and cultural context of New Orleans and South States' geographies of race, region, and literature also provides valuable insights. The issues of local, regional, and communal identity as represented in literary works are intrinsic to these discussions of the meaning of home. I'd like to turn to the idea of recovery and revision, which is part of rewriting New Orleans in contemporary literature. A sense of place in New Orleans literature reflects its history, as captured in Poet Laureate Natasha Trethewey's poem, Elegy for the Native Guards, which attends to the untold story of the 2nd Louisiana Native Guards, a unit composed of free men of color, the first Black unit on the Gulf frontier to meet Confederates in combat. Their efforts were lost to history and recovered in Trethewey's poetry. The website southernspaces.org tells her story and includes her reading of her poem and her journey to Ship Island off the Mississippi shore. The National Park Service is also very much involved in this website. She tells the story of where the regiment stood guard to make sure that imprisoned Confederate soldiers did not escape. Her poem then serves as a kind of monument, providing insights for readers who may not be familiar with this history, as she unveils the references to the island split in half by Hurricane Camille and the remains of the fort that housed the prisoners of war, the plaque that honors the dead Confederate soldiers, and the sea that holds the remains of the native guards in a final line that seems to echo Hurston's. She writes, "Only the fort remains, near 40 feet high, round, unfinished, half open to the sky, the elements, wind, rain, God's deliberate eye." The sense of place also appears in Trethewey's poetry as an exercise in process, a literary description of or commentary on a visual work of art, whether a painting or a photograph. Natasha Trethewey uses this technique in the collection Thrall in poems that respond to the topic of caste and paintings from earlier periods, and most significantly for this conference, her poems from Belloc's Ophelia, inspired by E.J. Belloc's photographs of sex workers in the Storyville section of New Orleans, its former red light district, taken in 1912. Many of the women were from an ethnically mixed heritage, and as she explains in her readings from this collection, in a lot of the New Orleans brothels, they published a blue book, where a lot of women's photographs would appear. They gave a racial designation of the women in these houses. These were very white-skinned, black women, who were more valuable because of whiteness on the outside and the perception of blackness on the inside. This is a quote from one of her readings. Over 100 years later, she gives the women a voice, imagines their stories, and brings them forth in what she calls their public and private lyrical self, which Ophelia embodies, raising questions about selfhood, work choices, and the exigencies that might have motivated them to migrate to the city. Their education, as they read and write letters home, the said and unsaid, speaking directly to the power relations that place them in New Orleans before they turn away from the reader or viewer. These views of the city over the century exhibit the dynamism of New Orleans as a port city and an urban space. The shift from the imagery of the city to the crossroads of social relations, the recovery of Belloq's photographs that appeared in a collection from the Museum of Modern Art in 1970, to the reimagined and revised narratives that appear in Trethewey's collection in 2002, raise questions about the position of women in this period and the intersections among photography, painting, poetry, and literary narratives. I'd also like to discuss recursiveness and renewal, focusing on the poetry of Brenda Marie Osby. She's a New Orleans poet who writes of the city with a beat and a spoken voice, including allusions to New Orleans myth and legend. The recursive spirit of New Orleans literature is captured in the poem Faubourg Study No. 3, The Seven Sisters of New Orleans, which Bruce informed us today is about the seven mystic sisters. This is from her collection All Saints, winner of the 1998 American Book Award, which imagines not the solitary visitor as those Belloq captured individually in his photographs, but rather a family of sisters that moves and survives by supporting each other, with one sister, Eulalie, baby sister, coming into spiritual practices in the community. Osby raises questions as she points to the spectrum of responses to spiritual healing, practices with which we are now more familiar from the presentations of Rachel Brunlin and Bruce Barnes, conjured in Osby's poetry in the legend of Erzulie, which she defines in the glossary as the Haitian representation of the Yoruba deity Oshun, which we saw in the video, goddess of the river waters. She then shifts to contemporary tourists who expect to have their fortunes told. The poem is told in the voice of a visitor and ends, I want to walk a little farther along the shallow water. I want to live a little longer with my dangerous dream. The title of the Curious Flower archive, which includes Osby's readings and annotated versions of her poetry, derives from Gwendolyn Brooks's poem, The Second Sermon on the Warpland, published in the Mecca in 1968. Brooks writes, the tongue cracks into curious flower, lifts its face all unashamed, and sways in wicked grace. I recommend visiting the Curious Flower Archive website, which includes themes central to discussions of African American poetry. Through such websites, which include poets from New Orleans, but not exclusively, along with digital platforms such as the Neighborhood Story Project, the reader from abroad can hear the voices and learn the stories of New Orleans, look up the references, and perhaps one day visit the city to understand this crossroads, this coming together of cultures, the recursive traditions of New Orleans. The final section is called Reckoning. In a New York Times essay, New Orleans is a place where there is violence in the sweetness, horror in the beauty. Scholar Imani Perry writes of many iconic figures, including the first mayor of New Orleans, Jean-Etienne de Bourgogne, the man who first granulated sugar in the United States under the tutelage of 2 Cubans. She writes, I cannot help thinking about sweetness born of the violence of slavery as a metaphor of New Orleans, which is a cradle holding together the South and its strands at the root. Like its native drink, the Sazerac, it's sweet and strong enough to knock you out. And of course, as often as people try to cut it off from the rest of the South, it functions like a phantom limb, one that we feel everywhere, even if we don't see it right there on us. The graves in New Orleans sit above ground because of potential flooding. And so the dead are raised and decorated with stunningly bright mausoleums and abundant flowers. The spirits hear the music and might be swaying too. In her most recent academic publication, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation, Perry weaves together the icons, artists, communities, history, and personal stories of the South to provide insights on the confluence of Southern and American history. And its Creole culture and history, New Orleans is a nexus of the South, posing and in some ways answering many of the crucial questions about race, history, representation, and identity that often arise in American study. In teaching and researching New Orleans, I've examined its difficult history in the context of Southern studies and American studies. I've tried to reckon with Hurricane Katrina and its various representations in literature, media, and visual culture, and have read and discussed the vast range of the city's literature by authors who permanently or temporarily called New Orleans their home. For the gift of learning more about its cultural history, live and in person, I'm indebted to Brian Wagner and the scholars visiting today. And the tradition of Mardi Gras, but out of season, I think of this conference starting early in the morning and ending late at night. Well, not too late, this is Munich after all. And I invite those who have attended today to continue the conversation. Thank you for your attention.